Hello, I'm Jeanine Nodder, and winding down my summer series of Meet the Candidates on Chattin with Jeanine. So this week we have a United States Congressman, Frank Ginta. So welcome, Frank.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Frankly speaking, I just want to introduce Josh Moore. Do you know Representative Josh Moore?
Of course.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We go way back.
He wanted to have you on his show, and he was out of slots, and I hijacked his show for a couple of weeks because I was out of slots. So I'm returning the favor, and here he is to co-host with me today.
Well, happy to see both of you.
Thank you. So Frank, Congressman, you're running for re-election for your third term?
Yeah, this would be my third term. I won in 2010. Unfortunately, I was not reelected in 2012. If you remember, that was the presidential year, and Republicans did not fare well in the state of New Hampshire. But decided to take a shot at it again in 2014, and was fortunate enough to win, the only Republican at the top of the ticket. And I actually topped the ticket in the district, and have been focusing largely on three major areas. I serve on the Financial Services Committee, the Budget Committee, and then I'm also chairman of the Congressional Task Force to combat heroin and opioid use. So it has been a rather busy term. Not really at the beginning of the term did I expect or anticipate to be dealing with the heroin and opioid crisis, but we went from 47th in the country in per capita deaths to third per capita deaths in less than a year. So that has been where my focus and attention primarily has been during this period of time.
Wow. Well, I do look at your voting record, and I have a magazine with me today. It's the New American magazine. A long time ago, like 1990, I had some articles published in this magazine, so I still get it. And every once in a while, they come out with a Freedom Index. So I was looking at the scores for both the Senate and the Congress, and I saw your scores. Let's see. Annie Custer got 13%. That was her high on the Freedom Index. And you got 70%. And at first I went, 70? Why isn't that 90? But then when I looked at all the other scores, I'm like, oh, actually 70 is very good. And you did explain like one of, let's talk about that National Defense Authorization Act.
Sure. So the National Defense Authorization Act is primarily how we pay for our military, our troops. And there were some small minor components in that bill that were not germane. We eliminated through amendment, or at least I voted against in amendment, but then voted for the overall bill because I think it's important to make sure that our troops are going to be paid and properly taken care of, and that we have a proper defense of the nation. Unfortunately, sometimes there's something in a bill that maybe you don't like, but you have to weigh the pros and the cons.
Right.
When the final legislation comes before you on the House floor. I had to do that as a state legislator as well, and you make the best decision you can. But I think if I'm not mistaken, I probably have the highest score in New England, not just New Hampshire. You
do, yeah. Yes.
So you know, freedom is important to me, liberty is important to me, following the Constitution is important to me, and those are some of my guiding principles as I represent the 1st Congressional District.
Did you want to ask the Congressman a question, Josh?
Yeah, I did. So you talked about how the heroin crisis and the issues that are going on in New Hampshire has been a top priority for you this past year or so, or even 2 years since it's been going on a little bit longer. What are some of the things that you've been able to accomplish in helping correct the problem, serving the constituents?
So the first thing I did was I went to leadership and said, look, you know, this congressional task force, in my view, should be bipartisan. And the leadership agreed with that. I said, we need to set a strong example that we are not going to be playing partisan politics. We are going to take care of our constituents. We're going to focus on good public policy. So I spent the better part of a year as chairman of the task force. We have 80 members of Congress on the task force. And I think that speaks to the legitimacy of the problem, the crisis, not just here in New Hampshire, but nationally. It speaks to the fact that so many members of Congress care very deeply about trying to address this illness. So I spent the better part of a year doing two things. Number one, hosting hearings both in New Hampshire and Washington, D.C., to try to get the best information possible as to what role does Congress have and what are the best practices in order to try to help. Secondly, I visited the southern border. I did that for two reasons. We talk about the southern border in the context of illegal immigration. We need to remind people that there are illicit drugs coming across that border heroin, most of which finds its way into New Hampshire. So going to that border and expanding the discussion beyond just illegal immigration, which, look, I don't support illegal immigration, I never have. I don't think it's the right way to enter the country. You obviously should be coming here legally. We are a nation of laws. But there's another reason to protect our borders, to secure our borders, because of the illicit drugs. So there are essentially 3 cartels that are bringing those drugs across the border, and they do it in many different ways. They'll have kids or adults as actual drug mules who will come back and forth across the border multiple times. Secondly, they'll have unmanned or single-manned aircraft come into U.S. airspace, drop the drugs into a geographic area that's difficult to get to for our border agents. Third, they will use the tunnels and smuggle drugs through the tunnels into our country. Or fourth, they'll use the actual ports of entry, which are still very porous. So we are unfortunately interdicting only 3 to 5% of the drugs. Virtually all of it is getting through. So when we talk about securing the border, I support that wholeheartedly. And what does that mean? Well, I saw the actual fence, the real fence that is 18 feet high, steel, where you have sensors in the ground, you have video surveillance, and you have border agents along the fence. In those areas, the fence is impenetrable. It works. Unfortunately, the problem is you go down the road a few miles, and you will find a different looking fence. One that is barbed wire with green stakes that you can buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, and you can easily walk right through. So, and I saw that firsthand. So when we talk about border security, I want people to also remember this deadly drug is coming into the U.S. In many ways through an unsecure border. So let's secure the border. Secondly, I visited Fort Bliss. I did that because
Where's Fort Bliss?
in Texas,
Oh, okay.
El Paso.
Yeah, we have a Texas story to tell you.
Okay. So the EPIC, the El Paso Intelligence Center, is on the Fort Bliss camp. And it's called EPIC, El Paso Intelligence Center. What they do is provide, they're an intelligence gathering capability, gathering capability organization that can help local police departments and agencies, federal, state, or local, throughout the nation, to stop and deter those who are distributing drugs. So I hosted a meeting about a month ago in New Hampshire with EPIC. We had most of the agencies here in New Hampshire participate, so we're creating better cohesion between the intelligence gathering capabilities and our smaller law enforcement agencies around the state of New Hampshire. On top of that, we passed the CARA legislation, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Passed the Senate, came to the House, and the recommendations of my task force were to break that bill apart into 4 major components. 18 different smaller bills went to the 4 different committees of jurisdiction for markup and review, bipartisan support for each one. Each one on the House floor passed bipartisanly. Then we put it back together, went to committee of conference with the Senate, passed it, and the president signed this bill into law about a month ago. And what does the law do? It does a number of key things. Number one, provides resources for education. Kids, unfortunately, are aware of illicit drugs and heroin, and they have access to them. So we've got to stop this before it starts. Secondly, it focuses on treatment, allows for things like drug courts, something I fought for through the amendment process and was victorious in achieving. And why should we do that? Well, when statistical data for New Hampshire suggests that if you have a heroin addiction, and I believe that is an illness, you go through a drug court, a long-term recovery or treatment program, 18 months. When you do that, you have a 69% chance of recovery, and it costs the taxpayer $8,000. If that same individual is incarcerated, the incarceration, depending on how long it is, $30,000 to $40,000 per year, and their likelihood of success is about 19%. So it doesn't work for the individual, nor does it work for the taxpayer when we're incarcerating. So based on that statistical data, we included additional efforts for drug money, for additional recovery court money, and also for additional treatment facilities and beds, which is something we need. And then two other components on the treatment side for women who are pregnant. Unfortunately, the state of New Hampshire for the last 5 years has not been identifying how many women are pregnant and having children, but we know that it's more than the 7 beds we have in the state of New Hampshire. So we provide for greater assistance there. And a woman that I've come to know very well, Abby Lazat, you may have heard me talk about her, last year was pregnant, on death's door, addicted to heroin. Thankfully, through the grace of God, she sought help. She had her baby, who is now healthy. Her baby's about 9 months old, and Abby is 8 months in recovery. It can happen. You can have that second opportunity, that second chance, and give yourself and your baby a future and a bright one.
This past year, I did a 2-part episode with a recovered drug addict who, I mean, he was on death's door too, just like that. And Dennis Hogan, our county attorney, was on with me because he sees it every day too, the drug problem. Josh and I did our first sine wave this morning because we're both running for re-election for the State House. And this man was walking by and he stopped to talk to us. He just moved here from Texas, and he couldn't stress enough how bad the situation is on the border, and that the mainstream media doesn't talk about it enough, that we have no idea how bad it is. And then he talked about a drug dealer that was caught. He was carrying a baby. The baby's wrapped up. There's no mom, there's no other kids, just this man and this baby. It turns out he had kidnapped this child. The baby was dead, and it was stuffed full of drugs. They took this little child's body and stuffed it full of drugs. And that was how awful these things have happened.
This is what we're dealing with, and this is the not just the illegal activity, but the inhumane activity that you're seeing on a regular basis when it comes to people bringing illegal or illicit drugs into this country. And that's why, unfortunately, 439 people died last year in New Hampshire. We're on track to either meet or exceed that number. We have to put a stop to it. So the other component is Veterans Affairs. Unfortunately, we don't have a full service VA here in the state of New Hampshire. So as a result of that, you have minimal options for pain relief. And unfortunately, what happens is our veterans are prescribed opioids, and the longer you're on an opioid, the higher the probability of becoming addicted. So we address that. And then the other component, which is the supply side, is public safety. We provide more resources for public safety, both at the local and the national level. But this is just the beginning of this fight. What I'd like to start considering are 2 major issues that have to be addressed at the federal level. Number one, the president's drug policy does not include eradication efforts in the agreement with Mexico. That's a change from past presidents. And some people will say, well, eradication in Mexico doesn't work. Well, my feeling is this: why not try to eradicate the drug in Mexico before it crosses the U.S. border? I think we have to have a greater, stronger partner in Mexico. Secondly, EPIC, which is the intelligence gathering capability center for the nation. I think we need to regionalize that, or consider regionalizing it. Put something here in New England that is going to provide immediate, long-term intelligence, not just to people in New Hampshire, but in New England, because the drug trade is coming across and from across the country, down into the southern part of the country and into Massachusetts, and it'll come up from the southern part of the country and from Lowell and Lawrence. So you have to have better cooperative relationships between states and between agencies, both state and federal. So I think that making the fusion center maybe as an idea, and I still want to seek input from different law enforcement agencies, both local and state, to see what is the best approach to take. But this is about coordinating information and attacking the problem at the root. That person who is selling drugs needs to be identified, and we need to use federal law, not state law, because federal law against them is far more severe. So those are 2 of the next steps that I'd like to take on. As we see the resources flow into the state, I'd like to see what in addition should we be doing. I've talked with physicians who are much more aware of the problem now, as well as dentists. We saw the first time in
Yeah,
June.
it rots your teeth.
That's true. But we saw for the first time, I think it was in June, a decline in opioid prescriptions, which was a good thing. 80% of the prescriptions worldwide are here in America.
What are they replacing them with?
Well, I think they're looking at alternatives to an opioid. I mean, look, when you look at the sphere of legal prescription drugs, you have on one end, the equivalent of a Motrin or an ibuprofen. Then there's a big blank space, and then there's opioids. So
is Percocet, is that?
that's an opioid.
Is it really?
That's an
Okay.
opioid.
So I don't know.
Now, again, if you take it
I'm an ibuprofen
responsibly and you take it for a shorter period of time, I mean, there may be a place for that prescription, but you've got to be extremely careful because opioids are so highly addictive.
What about a Tylenol with codeine?
That's an opioid.
Is it? Oh.
So there are different levels of opioids, and but that's why we need to be careful. Here's the normal scenario. You could be a young student athlete.
Yeah.
You have some sort of surgery, whether it's related to your
Wisdom teeth. That Tylenol with codeine. I've been through 5
sure.
kids that had Tylenol with codeine after their wisdom tooth.
So let's say you're taking that, and somehow, based on your personality, your addictive personality, you like that, and you continue to obtain a prescription, and then before you know it, you are hooked, and then you're moving into heroin.
And that's the stories we've been hearing over and over again.
That happens all the time. So, 4 out of 5 heroin abusers started with a legal opioid. So the facts are important for people to know. The more we can be aware, talk with our physician, but also talk with our pharmacist. The pharmacist is the chemist.
Oh, they know everything about the drug.
They do.
They're like, it's amazing. I like to just talk to the pharmacist about different things because sometimes, I don't want to offend any doctors, but sometimes I think the pharmacist actually knows more about drugs.
Well,
than
they're
doctors.
trained specifically in the world of chemistry. The
Right.
physician has more general training, and they don't receive the same level of training in medical school that a pharmacist does. So just based on that, I think there should be better coordination between the physician and the pharmacist.
So wow, that took up a lot of time, but I guess
It's an
that
important
is the number
subject.
one
Yeah,
issue because
no, it
I've been
is.
having candidates on all summer long, and actually that's what they're hearing. Their constituents are asking about is heroin.
Right, and
heroin problem.
we had just come out. We had just had the Granite Hammer bill, which unfortunately passed. I say that because I actually had Chief Doyle here on the show. We had a respectful discussion about it and everything. I voted against it because there was no treatment. We had an amendment on the House floor to provide treatment in the bill, and it was killed. And I was like totally confused because it's the one thing that a lot of our constituents are asking for. Many other people across the state of New Hampshire want the treatment side, and we're funneling money into the optics of the operation, and things like that. So,
there are those who will say that solve every problem by throwing money at it.
Right,
That
exactly.
doesn't always work. Like at the county government level, we actually only one of the reps in Merrimack voted for SATCO. Is that what they called it?
I think so.
It sounds like a treatment program, but they're not in it long enough for it to take effect. So it's just
Correct.
a waste of money.
So this is the key. You need to have a public safety component where we are reducing the supply. And then on the demand side, the treatment side, you need to have a plan that provides for a long enough treatment program. And when you have those two things, and they are working effectively, you can be effective at combating the crisis.
Right.
The one other point that I would add for the federal level is the resources are $192 million a year per year for 5 years. Now that is not adding to our deficit, or we're not borrowing that money. We have identified existing dollars for this program at the federal level. So it's important for us to be fiscally responsible, prioritize our budgeting, and address what I think most people look at as an epidemic in the nation.
I don't mean to deliberate on the subject and everything, but you brought up something really important. So you talked about for 5 years, there's $192 million allocated, and this is existing dollars. How does money exist when we have trillions of dollars in debt?
Yeah,
I mean,
good question.
Yeah, it's just, I guess it's a decent question to ask for viewers and stuff.
So my goal is we have about a $500 billion deficit. I'm on the budget committee. I was just added to the budget committee a few months ago, despite the fact that I voted against the budget last year in the omnibus because of the bloated spending, the $50 billion that was added, and some of the policy initiatives that were not included that should have been included. So I stood up to my own leadership and I said, I'm going to stand up for New Hampshire. This is not the way we should be addressing the problem. And what typically happens in Washington is when you go along, to get along, things happen that are good things for you. Well, here's what happened with me. I went against leadership. They came back to me a month later and said, we'd like you to get on the budget committee and actually solve the problem because of your experience previously on the committee, because of your 10 years as mayor, you understand and you can bring people together. So here's what I've accomplished already. I found $60 billion in reductions, requiring a balanced budget amendment, which I think is incredibly important. And I am going through line item by line item to find duplicative programs that I don't think are necessary or reasonable. So that's how we can eliminate the short-term deficit.
Okay.
Existing monies that are already appropriated, that are not adding to the deficit, but maybe going to a program that's older, outdated, or duplicative, is where we're getting resources for this $192 million a year for 5 years.
Yeah, I remember when that debt ceiling debate was going on, and there was an analogy that somebody used that, all right, let's say your basement is filled up with raw sewage. What are you going to do? Are you going to get the sewage out of the basement or just raise the ceiling?
Right. I think it's important.
Thank you for voting against the debt ceiling.
Yeah, I voted against the debt ceiling, the budget, the bailout for Puerto Rico, things that are important to fiscally conservative people. We need to be responsive and responsible to New Hampshire taxpayers.
Exactly.
As elected officials, you are supposed to be a steward of other people's money, and I take that seriously. So, and sometimes, unfortunately, you have to vote differently than how your own leadership wants you to vote. But I think that's why there's so much frustration right now
because
in this country.
If you run on the platform that, look, I'm going to be fiscally responsible, I'm not going to vote for taxes and fees, and that's how you have to vote and not go along with leadership.
I learned that lesson when I was mayor. The important thing was to set priorities, to identify, like I did as mayor, that we were going to cut taxes, we were going to be more responsible and thrifty with spending. And we're going to live within our means and find ways to deliver services better, more efficiently. And we were able to do that. We cut taxes for the first time. We cut borrowing. We were, rated one of the best managed cities and the best place to live in America as a result by CNN. You can actually do this in a responsible way and be responsible and responsive to your constituents.
Right. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. When there was a transfer of power between U.S. Congressman John Boehner and Paul Ryan, Ryan had actually stated that this new agenda of the Republican Party, we are going to stick with fiscal conservatism. And then about a month into it, he voted and pushed through what was a 1.5. Yeah, and I thought, what in the world are you doing?
So here's so let me talk to you a little bit about
that'd be great.
Because the budget, we were moving along at the appropriations bills, and then that process stopped through a series of procedural motions by the minority party, the Democrats. So as a result, let me back up. You start with the budget. The budget was passed with $50 billion in bloated spending, because in order to get Democrat votes. Then from there, the appropriations bills are based on that number. It stopped halfway through. So now at the end of the year, you get to an omnibus. Most of that negotiating was done under then Speaker Boehner. And then he retired, and Paul Ryan became the new Speaker toward the end of the calendar year. So he decided that rather than start fresh, he wanted to just continue bringing that forward based on the fact that there probably wasn't enough time in his mind legislatively to do something different. Here's what, and Paul is a friend of mine. I've served with him on the budget committee.
He has family in New Hampshire.
We served in Afghanistan together, and I respect him. But he and I have a difference of opinion on this. I would have preferred that we rip up that budget and start over. Even if you started at that point with a continuing resolution, spending would have been flat.
Yeah.
You would have saved $50 billion. Even though I don't think continuing resolutions are the best way to govern.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That would have been a better alternative at that point than adding $50 billion of new spending that, in my view, was unnecessary, particularly when we have a budget deficit.
So why did he make the decision, if you don't mind me asking?
Sure, we only have 2.5 minutes left.
I think it's because he felt that there just wasn't enough time to renegotiate a more legitimate or responsible omnibus.
Okay.
My strategy would have been different. My strategy would have been, this is going in the circular file. We're going to do a continuing resolution until we can come up with a better, more responsible budget agreement.
Okay.
So we're running out of time. I wanted to at least touch on one more of these bills that the Freedom Index looked at. So regulating the internet. You voted against having the federal government regulate the internet. So keep
Correct.
it free market. So you
It should
get
be a
plus
free
for
market
that.
entity.
Yes, and let's see, I don't know what we have time, the EPA, I mean, it just goes on and on, but you got a good score, so thank you very much for doing the job that
My
we
pleasure.
sent you to do. And I'm going to let you keep that
Great.
magazine, and
Thank
you
you.
can look up your colleagues. And in the last minute and a half, yeah, I just wanted to tell you, I met somebody this weekend who didn't know what a senator was. I said, okay, well, there's 2 for every state, and there's only 100 of them in the whole country. And there was a senator at this, well, you were there too, at the Mahajan in Manchester.
Yes.
And I said, that's a senator, that's a U.S. senator. Wow. So how many members are there in Congress? Because I learned that there are actually people who don't know.
435 House members. So Congress is made up of the House and Senate.
Yep.
We refer to the House as Congress, but that really is the House of Representatives. The United States Senate is the United States Senate. That makes up the legislative branch, and then we have the judicial branch, and then we have the executive branch.
So do they call you representative or congressman?
Both.
Because we will always call you congressman
Sure.
because we call ourselves representatives
That's
being on the state government.
yeah.
I think most people refer to the House members as congressmen, but there are those who also call us.
We are state congressmen.
Now, and thinking of that,
Technically,
that
but-
song from Green Day, do they really say the representative from California has the floor?
They do when you maybe not quite in that voice. it depends on who's in the it depends on who's in the chair. If you're ever a member of Congress, you can say it any way you want.
Okay.
But when you're in the chair and you're recognizing a gentleman or a gentle lady from, that is how you are introduced on the House floor. And then there are rules as to how you need to conduct yourself on the floor. You can't attack another member. You can't talk directly to another member. You always have to be speaking through the chair. So when you're making your argument on a piece of legislation, it's very easy to get passionate and maybe instead of
we do too.
you could be arguing with the person on the floor. You really have to direct those comments to the chair.
Oh, okay.
Sounds like New Hampshire House.
Yeah.
We
Same
talk
way
to
we
the
do it.
speaker. Thank you, Mr. Well, you have to go
Right.
on what's his name show. John, what's his name? I forgot. John Burt.
John Burt.
Go on John Burt's show and
Sure.
ask him to say thank you, Mr. Speaker, because he says it like nobody else and he makes us laugh. So anyway, I can see you now with my glasses on. You're like, oh, they're so strong. Thank you so much
No, my
for
pleasure.
coming on to the show, and thanks, Josh, for co-hosting.
Good to see you.
Congressman.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more show, or I might run a rerun. We'll see. And then September 13th is primary day, and I suppose we're all asking for your vote.
We are.
Yay.
So see you then.